We acknowledge that this event is taking place upon the traditional territories, the territories of the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Confederacy, the Anishinaabe peoples of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and before them the Chinantan Nation, called the Neutral by the French, and the Attawandaron by the surrounding nations. These people are the original caretakers, the peoples that lived on and intimately worked with these lands. We acknowledge that we have a responsibility to know and understand their heritage. The treaty that was signed for this territory is the Between the Lakes Treaty, No. 3 of 1792, and further the deed referred to as the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784, which applies to the land 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from the mouth to its source. We need to be aware of our role in these documents. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples upon this land. We acknowledge that we have an obligation to learn to live wisely together on this land.
Collection of biographies. I went through and picked out the women, and you're right, it's only about a quarter. But that's because men got all the press. And when I picked out the significant women on the list, I realized that they were predominantly born between the 1840s and the 1860s, 70s. And that was the time in which the New Woman phenomenon swept across Canada. And this is probably the best introduction to the topic. Pauline Johnson was the exemplar of the New Woman in this area anyway. Often identified with feminism, although not always a suffragist, the New Woman appeared in the Western world in the 1880s and survived until the 1920s. In real life, as well as in writing and on stage, the New Woman signaled modernity in its espousal of many causes, including better education, paid work, egalitarian marriage, and health and dress reform to improve her own lot and that of her sex in general. In the 1880s, the Canadian version appeared in the persons of teachers, businesswomen, doctors, and artists. For the first time, significant numbers of middle-class women set about to earn their own living, able to assert both respectability and some independence from their families. By the time the term New Woman had stabilized, its implications were being explored through the depiction of fictional heroes, including Canadian characters such as Sarah Jeanette Duncan's Edwina Murchison in The Imperialist. While the vast majority of women continue to link their fates to husband and children, many more expressed the hint of independence and even rebellion. And it goes on. Anyway, I went through the list, and I've tried to break them down into groups. I'd like to introduce the topic by looking at the antecedents. The daughters of Commodore Grant, Alexander Grant, 1734 to 1813, head of the Upper Canada Executive Council in 1805, had 11 daughters. They lived on the other side of the Detroit River in a log palace. And a quote from the Dictionary of Canadian Biographies: had a great many daughters, all very good looking, all very lively, all very fond of dancing, and all very willing to get married as soon as possible. And Brantford was actually the group of them were very much involved in the settlement of the Haldimand Tract. Archange married Thomas Dixon, the brother of William Dixon, who founded Galt. Isabella Grant married William Gilkison, who was the founder of both Prescott and Elora, and lived on the other side of the Brant crossing. Jane Cameron married William Richardson, who was the first bureaucrat in town. He was postmaster, took care of all the weddings and kept the statistics. He was also the brother of Major John Richardson, the first novelist of Upper Canada, and father-in-law of Henry Racy, founder of the Expositor. William Richardson was the first postmaster starting in 1832. Teresa Grant married Dr. Wright and was the mother-in-law of Robert Nicol, which is the name of the last township in the original grant. Anyway, so that's kind of how now these were all really important women, but we don't hear of them. And in the biographies of Dixon and Gilkison and Richardson and Nicol, they intimate that there was some connection between these men, but they didn't know exactly what it was. They were all married to sisters. And so the sisterhood was played a very important role in the settlement of this area, and introduced their men to each other and got them involved in all these settlement schemes and that sort of stuff. But there's almost nothing said about the women. That's for somebody else to do. Another early progressive woman was Alice Lemon, who came to Brantford in 1834, married David Keeler, who left Canada in 1835 because of the rebellion of 1837. She took over the Sentinel, the newspaper, from her father, who was a Lemon, and after David Keeler's death, made it known here, married into the Hart family, Dacres Hart, in 1849. She died in 1900. She is considered the first newspaper editor of any paper in Canada, and another important Brantford person. Anyway, that sets the field anyway. One of the first things that the new women needed was the ability to project on the stage. This was not a skill that women were used to doing. They didn't preach, and they were usually, played it very quiet. The Bells came to town. Alexander Melville Bell was one of the pioneers of the elocutionist movement. Alexander Graham Bell also preached, and his uncle, David Charles Bell, who was the first voice over the telephone, and he moved to the States in 1880. But anyway, the Bells played an important role in elocutionism in general. So, Brantford turned out a series of elocutionists. Pauline Johnson was considered one of the crowd. Another one in particular is a woman by the name of Effie Elaine Hext. Her father ran Hext Carriage here actually it was her father and her uncle. Two brothers ran Hext Carriage. And she was booked by Mr. Shipman, who was the stage manager. She was elocutionist and statuesque poser in Greek costume. She put on a show where she adopted poses appropriate to 45 different emotional states. And the audience loved it. They could tell exactly what she was acting out. And quite interesting. They were considered tableaux vivants. They were, the Brantford Carriage Works was a Deleuzian queen, and played an important role in the early town. And the last of the elocutionists, and we don't have a date of birth for her, is a woman by the name of Georgina Walker, who was, quote, one of Brantford's most popular colored daughters. Her father was formerly a slave in West Virginia and worked at Buck's store. Her career started in 1803 and was extremely popular. The family lived at 9 Park Ave, and the house was burned down and it's never been rebuilt. But anyway, those were the elocutionists. We had a woman in town by the name of Squire. She was a 12 Peel, known as Minnie, and she taught elocutionism, but I can't find anything about her. There's a lot of holes in this story. The Martin sisters, Dr. O. One of the Martin settlement near Keansville. The Martin family were burned out in 1847 by a crowd from Brantford who destroyed the home and set fire to it. So the family was dispersed. Dr. O went to university, became a medical doctor, on and on and on. There's a photograph in here of his sisters. This is quite the research project, I'll tell you. Well, there's one of them. Margaret, or Molly Flanders, who had a stage presence under the name of Princess Veracqua, the flower of the Mohawks. She was a healer and singer. Ended up marrying William Loft of the famous Loft family. Born in 1838, died in 1913, and had a sister who billed herself as Princess Neoscalita, who was Emma Washburn with her married name, also known as the Prairie Flower. Her brother Joe was part of the act, and I don't know anything about him. Nobody knows how many kids there were in the Martin family. It's at least a dozen, but it's never been written down. Nobody's done the research on the family. But Emma had a daughter, Lillian, who was known as Wymena, and she married into the family that ran the medicine show. And it's an amazing story, and I've never seen it written down in one place. There's more to it. We don't know exactly how many, but there were others in the Martin family that took to the stage and put on dramatic performances, and they count in the kind of the elocution movement. They also played with other groups. There was a Maggie, Princess Veracqua, toured at times with the Royal Indian Concert Company, which seems to have come from Six Nations, but there are no records of them. Google doesn't help one bit. But that's another topic for someone. One of the next groups of performers are the Webbling sisters. There's a street in Eagle Place by the name of Webbling Street. and his daughters named, some of the streets in the area are named after his kids. His Edward Henry Webling got the contract as butcher for the blind school and made out like he was really wealthy, had a racetrack in Eagle Place, had shares in the Brantford Vinegar Company, and he had a brother who, okay, how to put this, they're still in England. He had 5 daughters, 4 of whom took to the stage. One became an artist, and one of the daughters became Little Lord Fauntleroy in the British production of a play of that name, and they struck it rich. All kinds of money from this stage performance. And so they invested heavily in the author's next play and lost their shirt. The father was a silversmith, and he ended up sending his daughters to live with his uncle, or his brother, their uncle, here in Brantford. And while they were here, they became close friends with Pauline Johnson. Sarah Jeanette Duncan knew them. And when Pauline was doing tours in England, she would visit with the Webling sisters and all that. Josephine, who was born in 1862, married Alfred Watts, the son of the guy who put the generator plant at the cut. And then Lucy, the youngest of them, 1877 to 1952, married Walter McCrae, who was Pauline Johnson's manager when she was on the road for all those times. The marriage was not a success. It only lasted for a few years, but anyway. They have an amazing story all by themselves. And one of them went on to write the play based on Frankenstein's monster, and she was the one that had the monster and the mad scientist with the same name, and it became the source of the 1920 something or other play, or the movie Frankenstein, and they had quite a career. That's pretty much the hardcore elocutionists, the ones on the stage, but they also had a strong influence on Brantford's women writers. Sarah Jeanette Duncan in particular, 1861 to 1822. The Imperialist was written in 1904, and she was close friends with the Brown sisters, George Brown's daughters, at Beau Park. And there's romantic stories of Sarah Jeanette wandering the grounds of Beau Park and the peacocks in the environment. She was considered a pioneering journalist, left Canada in 1890, and in her career she wrote 20 books. The Imperialist is the only one that's survived, and it was, quote, largely unread until the 1960s. And in 1904, a reviewer disqualified her gender from writing on political subjects. So it was, anyway, she was brought up at 96 West Street, Thorpe's, and married a Brit who proposed to her at the Taj Mahal. And then another writer, and one of the charter members of the Brantford Historical Society in 1908, Augusta Gilkison, whose the granddaughter of the Gilgason that I mentioned at the beginning of this thing, William. She was the daughter of Jasper, who was the Indian agent and very close to the Johnson family and things on the reserve. Played an important role actually in reserve politics. Augusta was also the captain of the Lady Dufferin Guard, which was a marching group that paraded with dustpans and brooms. And were incredibly popular. They toured all over southern Ontario. And in 1931, Augusta was considered one of the best known ladies in the public life of Ontario. She was involved in all kinds of activities, and somebody really needs to explore her career. But it was impressive, it really was. One of the, an early historian, and she wrote, it looks like the majority of the material that the Brantford Historical Society published in the early days. All kinds of information on Six Nations and that sort of thing. I've also included her with Margaret Brown. The two of them founded the Six Nations Women's Patriotic League, which were important during the First World War. In particular, an enterprise where Six Nations was knitting socks for the soldiers in World War I. And there's a great story about how there was a smallpox outbreak and they refused to take the socks from Six Nations, but this smallpox outbreak was worse in Canada, in Brantford, and they accepted their socks. Anyway, she wrote a biography of Margaret Brown. Her husband was the governor of the jail, and they lived upstairs over the jail. She wrote a biography of Joseph Brown and wrote a book called Our Lady of the Snows, which was considered the bestseller of 1909 by the Canadian Bookman. An interesting character all by herself. She got in trouble with the Brantford Historical Society. Somebody had donated to the museum a photograph of Joseph Brant, and it had disappeared. And the museum was in the middle of some sort of a turmoil, and Margaret had taken it home with her and had neglected to return it. And they ended up booting her off the board. And there's a whole story there, but all we got just snippets of it. I've also included, she's a little late, like I said, the hardcore New Women seem to have been born up until the 1870s, but this woman was born in 1894, but I thought I'd include her because her story is incredible. She contracted meningitis as a child, was blind and lame, and later became deaf. But she graduated from BCI. She had 6 years of correspondence with Helen Keller and wrote a book called The Everlasting Beauty, which was quite exciting, I guess. She had a degree, an associate of the Conservatory of Expression in Toronto, so that's why I've included her in the elocutionists. I've included two women who made an appearance at the Mohawk Institute. Susan Hardy, 1868 to 1961, taught at the Mohawk Institute for 50 years, retired in 1936. The only teacher at the Mohawk Institute as an Indian. Graduated from the Brantford Model School in 1886, finished her education at BCI, and went on to the Toronto Normal School. And there's a window at the Mohawk Chapel dedicated to her, showing her teaching a bunch of kids. A complicated character. It is widely rumored, I guess it's more than a rumor, that she was put in the Mohawk Institute by one of the three Judge Hardys. They changed her last name from H-A-R-D-Y to H-A-R-D-I-E, but he paid for her education at the Mohawk Institute, and then she went on to teach there forever. And I've also included Alice Mary Boyce, who was an Ashton of the family that ran the Mohawk Institute from its inception. She was the last Ashton to run as, or to act as principal. She was acting principal from 1814 to 1815, and then principal from 1918 to 1922, until she married, and then she had to give up the position. That's how it worked back then. But anyway, she's Alice Mary Boyce, and was known to correspondents at the Mohawk Institute as A.M. Boyce. Boyce was her husband's name, and he was a piano teacher at the Brantford Ladies, Young Ladies College, and that's how they hooked up. And then on to the Brantford Young Ladies College. There was a reunion in the 1920s, and the library has it posted on their site, and all the people who came, and their regrets, and people who came from out of town, and on and on and on. But for whatever reason, the Brantford Young Ladies College was a hotbed of progressive women over the years. Jenny Bouchard, Jeanette Foster Kennedy, born in Toronto, lived with, her parents both died. She was living with an aunt in Owen Sound and was sent to the Young Ladies College, which was at the time considered one of the most prestigious schools in Canada. Ended up marrying Robert Bouchard, who had gone to England and had bought the recipe for Portland cement and had taken it back to British Columbia and had done an enormous 3.5-acre pit to extract the limestone that he needed to make the Portland cement. And his wife turned it into a garden. And it's a Bouchard garden.
Oh.
And she was here in Brantford for probably 3 or 4 years. I think that's the general course of study is about that long. Annie Gardner Barr, 1864 to 1921, considered artist and social reformer. She was at the Brantford Young Ladies College in 1883, and 10 years later was at the Alma Ladies College, both teaching and studying. Married George Brown in 1895 and moved to Saskatchewan. She was active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Young Women's Canadian Christian Association, YODE, on and on and on. Her husband was a graduate of BCI and became the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan between 1910 and 1915. And she's relatively famous for an award that she got from the King of Serbia for organizing World War I relief efforts for the Serbians. I don't know anything about that story. Adelaide Hunter Hoodless was also studied at the Young Ladies College. 1858-1910, married John Hoodless, whose family were living in the Thomas House in Canesville, which was moved quite a while ago. I was involved in the Heritage Committee when it was moved down by the River Road, down by the Six Nations. Anyway, Adelaide Hunter Hoodless was the second president of the Hamilton YWCA. Was on the National Council of Women in Canada, 1893. President in 1985 of the National YWCA. Founder of the Women's Institute in 1896. Persuaded the government to open the MacDonald Institute of Home Economics in 1902, which opened in 1904, and on and on. I've included her because she did have Brantford residence for the time that she was at the Young Ladies College, when they were living in Canesville. I've also included Gertrude Balmer Watt, who was born Mary Gertrude Sutherland Hogg in 1879, died in 1863, born in Guelph, died in Edmonton. She was an author, a journalist, and an antique dealer, had one of the largest collections of antiques in Canada, wrote 2 books, A Woman in the West in 1907, and Town and Trail in 1908, which seemed to be compendiums of her columns for the local paper. She was one of the Sweet 16, charter member of the Canadian Women's Press Club in 1904, the wife of an editor, Arthur Balmer Watt, they married in 1890, and mother of an author, Frederick Balmer Watt, who was a big deal in his day. Also from the cast of characters at the Young Ladies College, Lady Mann, born Jane Emily Williams in Ingersoll, married Donald Mann in 1887, who was one of the railroad builders. Contractor with the CPR, the founder of the Mann Cup, the prize for, it's a gold cup, for founded in 1910 for lacrosse. And they lived in Toronto at a home called Fallingbrook on Kingston Road. And then also from the Young Ladies College, Dr. Margaret Donald Gordon. And I haven't got a date of birth or date of death for her, but she became one of the first professional dentists in Canada, and began work in 1913 with the Municipal Dental Clinic, which was a not-for-profit, the first free dentistry organization in Canada at 468 Yonge Street at College. And she was a big deal. When I first started researching her, I found all kinds of information about Dr. Margaret Gordon, but there were problems with the dates. They were really close, but they didn't line up, and it turned out that there were 2 Dr. Margaret Gordons. One was a medical doctor, and one was a dentist. And they were born in the same year, and their careers lined up exactly, and it took me the longest time to get them straightened out. Finally got their gravestones, and they had 2 different middle names, so I was able to. But anyway, she appeared at the reunion of the Young Ladies College and served tea. And then I collected the women who went on to become the first in their classes at university. George Brown's daughters, Catherine, 1866 and 1890, and Margaret, who was 1864 to 1930. I don't know when Catherine died. But anyway, they were at Beaupark Farms between 1866 and 1890. And Catherine and Margaret were part of the University of Toronto 5, the first 5 women to graduate from the University of Toronto. They both had BAs in modern language. And then Elizabeth de Saint-Remy, who was part of an obscure Brantford story about the half-pay officers. Elizabeth came to Brantford to live with her uncle on property that was close to the good residence. Anyway, she was the first woman to be successfully enrolled at Queen's in 1878. She only went to classes for a year. She didn't pursue a degree. But anyway, she ended up in Kingston, stayed in Kingston, and between 1871 and 1885 ran a school in Kingston. Date of birth 1841, died in 1930. But that whole story of that group of people that were all hanging together off of what's now Hardy Road, and there was one of the sons of one of those families, or a nephew, came down with a tropical disease in Jamaica. This bunch had Jamaican roots, and came to Brantford to recover because the conditions were better. And while he was here, wrote a novel called Miss Bush's I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, a professor at York was, he's a student of the Jamaican diaspora, and tracked down this novel. It had gone out of print, and he'd been able to find a serialized version of it in a Jamaican newspaper, and had reassembled the book and published it with an extensive foreword. And in it he tells the story of how this book came to be. And I got in touch with him, and we met at the Blue Dog ages ago. And it turns out we went to the same university together. But anyway, it's a really interesting story. And then I picked up a couple of other things. No, she's too late. She's too late. I added in Augusta Stowe Gullen, 1857-1943, the first woman to graduate from the Canadian Medical School, Victoria University. Married Dr. Benjamin Gullen, 1855 to 1944. The first staff member at Toronto Western Hospital. And her daughter, Emily Howard Stowe, 1831, no, her mother, 1831-1903, was the first woman principal in Canada and the founder of the Canadian Women's Suffrage Association, and the first female physician to publicly practice, although she didn't have a degree. That was her mother. And of course, this is a Mount Pleasant story. The eight-sided house that still stands. I've also included a group of artists. Lilius Ethelwyn Carlisle, 1910 to 2008, which is a little late for being a new woman, but she certainly fits the bill. She was Thomas Carlyle's nephew's granddaughter. And Thomas Carlyle is famous for this quote: "History is the essence of innumerable biographies." And that's just kind of one of my favorite things. Ethelwyn Carlyle spent 10 years as a technical illustrator at Cockshut's, and also worked with Hazel Devereux at that time. Her mother, who comes closer to being a new woman, 1884, was a China artist. And Hazel Devereux, who was Hazel Wellington Devereux, 1902 to 1982, again, a little late for being a new woman, but she certainly practiced it, was the chair of the Trades and Profession group at the National Council of Women. Taught grade 8 for 34 years. Friend of A.Y. Jackson's, had a summer cottage at Barry's Bay that the group of 7 hung out at. I also picked up, I'll skip her, she's late too. But anyway, like I say, it's a lot of moving parts. But we played an important role in that movement. The pushback against the new woman was extreme. They were considered mad women, and the churches in particular were trying to get women to get back to being, the founts of purity and all that sort of stuff, and stay in the family and don't make waves and don't go on the stage. Pauline Johnson's mother was really upset with her daughter going crazy that way. And her other daughter, Evelyn, Eva, played a more traditional role and became a housekeeper for the rich all over North America, and ended up featuring in the Immigrant Project's Chinese story. She took a room upstairs over the Princess Cafe, which is on Toulouse Street, and when she died, she had left presents for the Chinese family downstairs in her will. So I didn't include her, but I probably should have. She became quite an important interpreter of Six Nations politics and history in her old age, and played a role in the pushback against the way the Mohawk Institute was being run, and was one of the first, as far as I know, to call attention to some of the stuff that was going on there. Now, during the time that the Ashtons ran the Mohawk Institute, I don't see any evidence of any real pushback. But in 1822, the federal government took it over. And that's when they started getting really questionable people running the organization, and some of the weird stuff that started going on now. But the Ashton family married into the Cockshuts, and they're a really important part of Brantford's industrial history. And I think that's about it.